that he had a very, very significant connection with Eastern thought. So he I think in his 30s, he read the Upanishads and some of the other Eastern texts. And as my understanding, and I corresponded and I meet regularly every now and again, Michel Bitbol is a professor at one of the universities in Paris. He's an expert on Schrödinger, and especially on the philosophy of Schrödinger. And I've talked about him with this aspect at length. And he said it was very, very clear that Schrödinger was very influenced by Eastern thought. And this next quote actually shows this in the way he frames it explicitly, but also is very different to this objective realism that I just mentioned. So he says, there was this article that he wrote, The Arithmetic Paradox, The Oneness of Mind. So in the same volume that came out was about his different talks. One was called The Principle of Objectivation, the other one was called The Arithmetic Paradox, The Oneness of Mind. And out of that, he said a number of things, and this particular quote was written in a letter to one of his very, very close students. And it's about this one mind. And that subject and object, there is no duality. Right? There is no duality between the subject and object. So he said the very, very old Indian Tattva Asi, this art thou, or subject or object one, is of course not a physical but rather a metaphysical statement. It is so simple that it is impossible to explain it. It cannot be grasped by the intellect, but it may spring up in you at some occasion like a spark. Right, so suddenly there is the realization that subject and object are one. And it is there and will never really leave you, okay, even though it's not a practical maxim to use in every hour of your life. So here Schrödinger is not denying that if we step back into this objective, it's actually useful to perceive the world in terms of these objects. So we can navigate, we can do things. That I know that something's a hammer, I can use it to hammer things. Right? But he says that suddenly, like a spark, there's this realization, this very, very direct experience that he says is so simple. Right? And it's you feel by what he says, he directly experienced this himself. And he says it springs up and equates you like a spark. Okay? And then this is one of the quotes that he had around this one mind. And this sort of resonates with a lot of Zen teaching, because one of the basic and very, very important questions in Zen is what is the nature of reality, and to see directly that the nature of reality is not separate. There is no separate observer to the reality out there. In fact, one of the first Zen masters that came to the West said something like, one of our biggest problems of human beings is thinking that I'm here and the world is out there. So much of Zen practice is actually to directly experience that there is no separation between subject and object. There is just this one life, one experience, this oneness, or one mind, as Schrödinger talked about. Now, you can sort of take Schrödinger wrote this, I think, in the 1940s. This is a quote from Huang Po, which was a Chinese Zen master in 850 AD, and he said, a perception, sudden as blinking. So same as Schrödinger, there's something sudden about it. There's a perception, sudden as blinking, that subject and object are one, will lead to a deeply mysterious, wordless understanding. And by this understanding, you will awake to the truth of Zen. So he's talking about a direct experience of the subject and object of this oneness, of this one mind that Schrödinger was talking about. This is more of a tangential slide, but I couldn't resist putting it in because I was interested in the question that because Schrödinger was concerning himself with this one mind, he was writing about it. I was interested in whether any of his physics actually started developing in that direction. And the answer is no. I confirmed this with Michel Bitbol. At least we don't know anything about that he was looking at physics in terms of this one mind. And this quote actually sort of explains why. He says, On the one hand, the essential unity of the world arises from its fragmentation among individual consciousnesses, not because of a cogent philosophical argument, but through a mystical awareness. Once again, this mystical sudden awareness. On the other hand, this very oneness, being independent from single observers, make quantum mechanics unacceptable and urgently requires a new theory. So here, essentially what this is saying is that quantum mechanics or quantum theory, that he's saying is not suitable. If we actually want to develop the physics, if this was the question, the physics of this one mind, or try to formalise it in some sense, in a mathematical sense, he was saying that quantum mechanics won't be able to do it, that we need a new theory in order to do this. And there's a wonderful book by Shanamvi called Nature Loves to Hide. It's quantum physics from a Western philosophical perspective. And in the third part of his book, he devotes this, he calls it Physics and the One. And he said the next task of physics, this is a very, very bold and very, very speculative statement, which many physicists wouldn't agree with. He's saying that the next task of physics is to transcend subject-object duality. And so I don't know if many physicists are trying to take that up, but he was in the same sort of mind as Schrödinger was here. So let's summarise a bit. So we have this principle of objectivation, or which is the basis of this objective realism. So we create this objective reality out there by stepping back as this observer in the shadows. And Schrödinger, later in that text, when he was describing the principle of objectivation, he talked about the hypothesis of the real world out there. So normally we don't consider the world out there as a hypothesis, but he was saying by stepping back like that, there is the hypothesis rises that there is a real world out there. So when we notice that when we create this objectified reality of objects, the next step is that an objective realism, in its actual definition, sort of formalises it. These objects are persisting through time. Einstein saying, well, even when I'm not looking at the moon, it's out there. Right, so these objects, they might have a life, but when they're there, when they're existing through time. Okay, so if these objects stand in relation to the subject, that means that the subject who's observing them, even though he's in the shadow, is also persisting through time. So, so this is the essence of this argument around subject-object duality. This is a time-based notion. It must necessarily be a time-based notion, and the notion of time we're talking about is our common sense linear notions of time. Okay, so as we go through this talk, we'll see that perhaps our common sense notions of what time is perhaps aren't the real time. So let's look at the other side, the world of the one mind. So yeah, Schrödinger, Huang Po, many other masters, not only in the Zen tradition, say that subject and object are one. There's just this oneness. One life, one experience, one mind. No mind, sometimes you say in Zen. And this experience is sudden. So both Schrödinger and Huang Po talk about this perception sudden was blinking, or suddenly it happens. Okay, so if that's the case, what's time here? So we have to ask ourselves, so it's a lot clearer when we talk about subject-object duality. We have these objects persisting through time, even when we're not looking at it, but suddenly there is this perception, suddenly is blinking. What's the notion of time that's related to an experience like that? Is it related to our everyday common sense notions of time? Is it related to the time that scientists and physicists use? So this is the question that I was asking and then trying to penetrate. Okay, so everything okay so far? Yep. Okay. This is another quote from Schrödinger where he's talking about this one mind, and then he's talking about how it relates to time. So this, maybe he can give us a clue in relation to this question I just posed. He says mind is by its very nature a singular tantum, or a singular such, right, in Latin. I should say the overall number of minds is just one. So once again, he's talking about this one mind. So we think we have these individual consciousnesses, but Schrödinger denies that in that article about the arithmetic paradox of oneness of mind. So the paradox is we have this notion that all of us have our individual minds. He says, no, that's not the case. There's only this one mind. And he says that the number of minds is just one. I venture to call it indestructible since it has a peculiar timetable. So here he goes into time. And what's the timetable? Namely, mind is always now. That's what he said. Mind is always now. So there is really no before and no after for mind. There is only now that includes memories and expectations. So all our memories are manifesting now. All our expectations we have for the future, they're manifesting now in this one mind. Okay, so this is Schrödinger's point. So if for those that have meditative practices, maybe you can relate to this directly on the basis of your own meditative or practice experience. Sometimes, usually we have this sense of self. We have this sense of self through which we normally negotiate our life and our way through reality. By following meditative practices, sense of self or an ego, or what we refer to as I, me or my, suddenly this can drop away. And then there is a direct, unmediated experience with now. And my muscles, or now awareness, or this. Direct experience, not mediated by self-construction, and not coloured in any sort of way. It directly experiences one now. Okay, so but what notion of time is there? So there's no subject-object, there's just this one. Okay, so how could we start to conceptualise that? Well, you imagine that there's someone's meditating and suddenly they have this direct experience of the one mind. So how do we view that? So here's a diagram that took out of physics. Time is this axis going up. So we think about a linear notion of time. You have these things called light cones, which are used in relativity and things that Einstein developed. And the now is sort of here, this plane that's in between the future life cone and the past life cone. And you imagine, okay, so it's such an experience.